Shut up over there. It's pretty noisy out here with these birds. Anyway, how many times have you taken a landscape photo where you've got the foreground in focus or the background in focus and you wish the whole thing could be in focus? Well, so unless you've hit that sweet spot of aperture and focus distance called hyperfocal distance, you're not likely to get all elements in focus. So one way of doing that, or getting around that, is to shoot several shots at different focal distances and stacking them together. That's called focal stacking, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go inside and play with my Matchbox toys. I've opened up 6 files here already in Photoshop. There is another way of doing it through Lightroom, and I'll show you that in a minute. These 6 photos, and I'll step through them, and you can see each one here has a tab of its own, is basically of the same scene, but as I click through them, you'll see that the focus point gradually moves toward the rear, and you can see the little car in the front is now out of focus on that one. Go back to the first one again, you'll see the front car is in focus and so on. So basically what I did was just advance the focus point through each of these images until I'd finally focused on the rear car. And in doing so, what happens is the effective focal length of the lens changes a little bit as you refocus. In other words, it's almost as if you're zooming in or out slightly. So what we have to do in Photoshop is to realign all those images so that it looks at the content in the images and aligns them together. So now we've got all 6 of these images open, and again, I'll show you how to do this from Lightroom. It's just as easy, if not easier. But for now, once you've got images open in Photoshop, let's go to File, Automate, and down at the bottom, you'll see something called Photo Merge, and this is something you'd use if you're doing a panoramic. But in this case, we're just going to try to align these images, and so we're using this function for that only. So you can click on, since we've already got the files open, we'll just add open files. If they're not open already, you can just go to the Browse button and start loading them this way. And I'm going to stay with the auto layout for the moment, and this down here where it says blend images together, make sure that's unticked for the moment. So we're just strictly going to use this to align all these images. So I'll click OK. And now Photoshop is going to create another file called Untitled Panorama 1. Don't be put off by the fact that it's calling it a panorama. It's not actually. It's just doing an alignment for all those images. And you can see there it says aligning each of those layers. So what it's done is it's created now another file, this one again called Untitled Panorama 1, and it's actually stacked all of those individual files into one file as layers. In Lightroom now, I'm going to show you how to do essentially the same things we just did in Photoshop, except we're going to start in Lightroom and have these 6 images pulled into Photoshop and have them automatically align in several layers within a single file. So let's start by hitting Shift and then the end image here so that all of the images we want to take into Photoshop are highlighted. And it doesn't matter in which one, but we just right click on one of them. You'll see something called Edit In. And if you go to the bottom of that flyout, it says Open as Layers in Photoshop. And you can see it's starting to build it up over here. It says Load Layers. So it's bringing each of these 6 individual images in and assigning each one to a layer in a single file. And once that's done, we're going to align them just like we did when we opened them in Photoshop. And there we are. So it's loaded all 6 into individual layers, and it's under one file name here. So by clicking the eyeball icon here, I can shut off that topmost layer, and you can see the next one I've shut off. You can see that we're eventually getting down to this bottom layer here. If I click that off, you'll just see a transparent background. So they're now stacked, but we're not sure that they're perfectly aligned. So I'm just going to switch these on again. So what we have to do next is highlight all of the layers at once. So I'm going to hit Shift and then click. So now they're all highlighted, and then go up to Edit, and it says Auto Align Layers. Don't use Auto Blend at this point, just Auto Align Layers. And you'll see this Auto setting, just leave it at that, and just click OK. And now it's going to look at the content again, just like it did when we opened them in Photoshop originally. And it's going to align the content, or align them based on content, I should say. By the way, if they come in an order that you don't like, and I didn't intend for them to come in with the smallest number file name on the top and the largest one on the bottom, I wanted to reverse them. So what you can do is just make sure that they're all highlighted still, and then go up to Layer on the top menu, down to Arrange, and Reverse. And now you'll notice that 488 is on the bottom and 493 is on the top. Now, if you've just got one out of order, let's just say it's this 491 is in the wrong place, you want to move it up, you can just click on that layer and drag it up until you see that kind of blue bar, and it will insert it at that point. So now I've changed the order of these. But if they're generally in the right numerical order or whatever, or right order, and you just want to flip them around, you can just highlight them all, go up to Layer, Arrange, and then Reverse. Let's just have a look at what's in each of these layers, and then we can decide what to do. So if I shut off every layer except for the bottom one, you can see that the car in the foreground is in focus, and then everything else gradually falls out of focus because we have a relatively shallow depth of field. When you're focusing closely on something, the closer you focus, the shallower the depth of field gets. So in this case, shooting some relatively close and small objects, that depth of field effect is going to get exaggerated. So if we switch on the next layer here, you notice it brings the second car a bit more into focus, and then as we just keep going on up, we're actually looking just at the topmost layer that has its eyeball icon on, because each layer is opaque. We're not actually seeing these layers down below, we're just seeing the next one up. So as we progressively go up here, you'll notice that the foreground car is going out of focus, and the background car is getting more and more in focus. So what we need to do, for instance, on this layer, this topmost layer, we need to somehow get rid of the part of it, as I'm swiping over right now, that's generally out of focus, and just show on that layer the part that's in focus, in this case the rearmost car. I notice I'm on the one of the middle layers here. So if we shut off each of these layers and just look at the bottom one, it's the opposite. We want to now take out of that layer the out of focus portion. We don't want that contributing to the final image. So in other words, what we're doing is we're looking at each layer and just selecting that part of each layer that's in focus. The method by which we're going to take out those unwanted parts of each layer is by way of layer masks. And if you have watched my video or my video tutorial on compositing with Photoshop, and I'll put a card up top so you've got a link to it, you'll know that what we use to do that is layer masks. So what we can do on each layer here, I'm going to just switch them all back on again by clicking the eyeball icon back on. If you notice down here, there's this icon on the bottom of the layers bar, And this means that you're going to add a layer mask to each of the layers. So we'll do them. We can, I think we can probably just highlight them all. I may be wrong. No, it's not going to allow me to do it. So one at a time, we'll just add a layer mask to each of these layers. And that's where we're going to do our work in terms of removing the out of focus portion in each layer. Over here on this color patch, you've got a black patch and a white patch. And to work within a mask, a layer mask, you have to click on that layer mask. As you can see on the top layer, we'll just show an example. And then you typically just use a brush, a black brush, meaning it will take out parts of that layer, and a white brush, meaning it'll restore parts of that layer. I'm just going to show you an alternative way of doing it for the moment, because we've got images that are pretty straightforward here. There's just sort of one region of each of the layers that's out of focus. So we could possibly use something called a gradient tool. And if you look over on the left here on the toolbar, I'm just going to show you what else is on that, just in case you can't find it. There's a paint bucket tool, 3D material drop tool, and a gradient tool. We're just going to try that gradient tool for a minute. So on this top layer here, where our foreground is out of focus, we want to get rid of that. So what we would do is start with that gradient tool. We'll click on the bottom and just drag up into just where it starts to get sharp again. And what that'll do, if you look over in the mask itself, it's created black at the bottom, and then it's gradually faded out to white at the top. And where it's black, wherever it's black, that means it's going to block that part of that layer, and where it's white, it'll let that part of that layer through. By leaving these other layers activated, however, you can't really see what the effect is. I can actually disable the layer mask and re-enable it just by right-clicking, disable layer mask to see what effect it has, and then clicking it again. You don't really see much happening down here, and the reason is that this is actually, if you like, burned a hole. This black region has burned a hole in the top layer, and it's allowing you to see down below. So you're seeing the other layers where there is, particularly on the next layer down, where the front car is still out of focus. So the best way to work with this is to turn all of the other layers off and just have a look at what effect this is having. So now what we're seeing is this transparent background that gets gradually more and more transparent, I guess, as you get toward the top. And that's the effect of this gradient mask here. So we're going to use that for now. I'm going to leave that on this top layer. But as you'll see, it's probably better to go over and use the brush tool when we're getting down to these lower layers, because we're actually going to create a kind of a band where we're going to leave part of the layer intact, but get rid of the rest of the layer using the layer mask. So let's just do that. I'm going to turn on the next layer down and turn the top layer off for a moment. And what I can see here is that the very topmost part of the image on this second layer down is that starting to go out of focus. So I want to get rid of that as well. So I'm going to go over to my brush tool here, and I've got a fairly large brush. You can select it up here. You can change the hardness of the brush. I have it set to 20%, and it's a 1100 pixel brush, so it's pretty large. And I can see that from the grid here, that this part of the image is somewhat out of focus. So I'm going to just start taking a little bit of that out. And now the advantage of doing it this way, by turning all the other layers off, is I can see what's left and what's left on that layer that is still in focus. And obviously the front part of this is quite out of focus, so I'm going to take that out. And it's not looking too bad without getting too close to it. Our car there is, I'd say that's probably the layer where it's most in focus, this middle car. So now, as you can see, if you look at the mask, we've actually created a kind of a little window or a little band where this was basically my plane of focus on this particular shot. So we can continue on like that, going down to the next layer, making sure you click on the layer mask and just blitzing out anything with that black brush that looks like it's out of focus. And I think we can take this one a little further down this time. And obviously our foreground is badly out of focus, so we'll take that out. And so now we have another band of focus, which you can see from the layers here, the layer masks, that we've actually moved it down a little bit because that's where our main plane of focus is. So let's switch on the next one down. And as you can see, the background is starting to really, or the rearmost car, I should say, is starting to really go out of focus. The middle car seems to be in focus to an extent on the front, so I'm going to leave that okay, or leave it as is, I should say. The rear of this little red sports car is sharp. The front's still a little bit soft, so we now know what areas we have to take out. So I'm going to take out most of this, and I'm using the grid as a bit of a reference to see what's in focus and what isn't. It's probably the best thing to use. So now our band of focus has shifted down yet again. Maybe we're a bit too generous with this, but let's see what the end result is. By the time we get through to the bottom, I'm going to take the next layer, click on its layer mask, and take all that out of focus stuff out of there. And it looks like just using the grid as a reference, we probably want to come down to about there. Not absolutely sure. It looks a little soft in the front here. We'll soon find out if we've gone too far. And then, of course, on the bottommost layer where we should be in focus at the closest point, which is the front of this grid here. Click on the layer mask for that and just start taking away anything behind that. This is a really simple example, actually, because of the way things are laid out. It's so clear because of the grid, and that's why I'm using this as an example. But it can be a little tricky sometimes doing it with a more complex sort of landscape type of layered image, where it's really hard to tell which layer is creating a little bit of a fuzzy area. So let's just turn everything on and just see how much of a mess we've made here. And I must say, that's not bad for a first approach, but I can see that this guy is a little out of focus here. So it's a matter of now going through each of these and shutting off all the layers and just finding out which one is the culprit. And it looks like maybe somewhere in this area that we've got a bit of a problem. I'm just going to look at one layer right now. Let's just switch all these off. You can see that the mask is actually taking out part of the rear of this little car, which might well be in focus. So if you ever find you've gone too far, just as you can see, this is switched over to the white as being the foreground color now. You just use that double arrow to switch back and forth. So now our brush, and we can actually take the brush down a bit in size, I think. Our brush is now going to take out part of that layer mask. As you can see, we've just revealed what looks like a sharp part on the car. So we can now have a look again just to see if that's fixed the problem. It does seem to have. I'm not saying this is perfect at this point. So I noticed that this guy is still a little bit out of focus. So let's just have a look at the, start at the top here, shut off that layer, shut off that layer. And you notice from here on down, it looks pretty sharp. So I think we can probably figure that one or both of these top two layers is at fault for not taking out the out of focus parts of this car. So let's start on the top and just see what we can get. So let's click on that gradient, that mask that's filled with gradient right now, and go over to a brush and start brushing around there. I think it's actually improving it somewhat, but it doesn't seem to be perfect. So let's go to the next one down and go over it as well. We'll go over the car, and lo and behold, it's coming up nice and sharp. But look at that, we've gone too far, which means we've got two layers where we've, or all the layers are now blocking out that part of the car. So you're seeing right through, right down to the bottom, which is transparent. So that means we've gone too far with that one. So I'm going to go over here and go to a white brush and reestablish that. And we take that out. It looks pretty good. And I think that's our finished image. Having taken you through all that, there is actually an easier way to do this. But it doesn't always work out perfectly, and I'll show you. So now we've got our stack of layers here. We brought in from Lightroom. And let's go over to edit. This is a step I skipped before. Remember, we used auto align layers to align the layers. Now let's go to auto blend layers, and this is where it will do all that painting within the mask for you. Within the masks, I should say. Okay, so once you click auto blend images, you get this dialog box up, and it's where you either select panorama or stack images. And in this case, we're going to just stack the images. So click OK, and now it's going to blend them. It's actually going to create a set of masks automatically, so you don't have to put them in like we did before with the manual method. And there you go. You can see each mask is quite different, but let's have a look at these. I'm going to switch off all the lower layers here. You can see how strange to an extent these masks are. They're not as straightforward as what we were doing. We were just kind of creating bands where everything was in focus. This is actually using AI to find parts of the image that Photoshop thinks are the sharpest and just blotting everything else out. We go down to the next one. I guess we can leave them all on progressively. And the next one, it is actually doing a good job of choosing those parts of the image that are absolutely sharply in focus, which is kind of hard to do by the manual method. Let's turn that on, and that on. It's not too far off the mark, but you notice you get some anomalies here, these little funny areas where it's kind of gone a little wobbly, where it's not being able to determine what belongs on that layer and what doesn't. And that can be a problem with Photoshop. So what I would suggest is maybe you try this first, and if the auto blend doesn't work, then by all means go back in and adjust. You can either adjust the masks as you see them here, or you can just create new ones yourself and just paint in them as we did earlier. Anyway, that's it. You're done. So one thing I should have mentioned earlier is that when you're doing your focus stacking, when you're out taking the shots, when you refocus, make sure there's at least 25% overlap between each of those focus zones. Otherwise, when you get it back into Photoshop and you start stacking them, you might realize that none of the layers, none of the constituent images have a certain part of the scene in perfect focus, in which case there's nothing you can do about it. So make sure you use as much overlap as possible, take as many shots as you need to achieve that, and have some fun with it.